Hello, everyone. Thank you. Welcome to the session, Ask What DH Can Do For You, presented by Lisa Goddard. We'd like to thank the Canadian Association of Research Libraries for their generous sponsorship of this session. Lisa is the Associate University Librarian for Digital Scholarship and Strategy at University of Victoria. She holds degrees from Queen's, McGill, and Memorial University, and is currently completing an MA in Humanities Computing at the University of Alberta. Lisa's research interests include open access publishing, semantic web technologies, digital publishing and preservation, and the digital humanities. Please join me in welcoming Lisa.
Thanks, guys. I'm so pleased to be back at Access. There are so many of my favorite librarians here and smart people in the room. And some of you know that I took a new job this year at University of Victoria Libraries. And in my new position, a lot of what I'm doing is kind of thinking about how the library can integrate better with digital scholarship on campus. And at UVic, we're really lucky because we have a lot of digital humanities scholars and a lot of big funded projects happening in this area. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. But also, I'm a little cognizant of the fact that we've spent a lot of time now talking about how libraries can serve the digital humanities and doing a lot of hand-wringing about whether, we're up to the task. So I wanted to take a little twist on that and talk more about how I think digital humanities can serve libraries. Why are we in this partnership and what's in it for us? And I think, in fact, the more that I work in this area, I can see some really clear kind of alignments. So, most of it really hangs around these digital collections that most of us have been developing for, 10 years now. And libraries have been pretty good at getting funding to digitize things and put them online, but we're not necessarily good at getting funding to develop those collections in a variety of interesting ways and to make them really kind of digitally native. So there's some real complementarities, I think, between the way libraries work and the way that kind of scholarly production happens, that I can see some really important partnerships here that can help us to move some of these things forward. And one of those things is the funding cycles that each of us have. So libraries have these kind of steady-go budgets that keep the lights on and support infrastructure over time. But it's not easy for us to get an infusion of like $1 million to do a prototype or $500,000 to recatalog everything. Digital humanities scholars have the opposite problem. It's easy-ish for them to get money in these kind of 3 to 5 year funding cycles from places like SSHRC to do specific research projects, but they don't necessarily have infrastructure and space and support and any funding beyond the end of that project cycle. So there's automatically a kind of a good partnership there where we could maybe imagine the digital humanities as like the research arm of libraries. I don't know that the digital humanists would actually love to hear themselves described that way, but for the purpose of this presentation and from our perspective, I think that actually you could kind of conceive of that. The other thing that is complementary in the way that we work is that we have these kind of complementary pools of labor. So in the library, we have, a fairly decent number of permanent staff who get it done every day and will be there for years. And we have a lot of expertise. But it's not easy to suddenly, decide now, everyone's just gonna work on XML this year. That's what you're all doing, so stop what you're doing and start doing that. We can't just, reposition people very quickly, and we can't build new skill sets that quickly. DH, once again, it has the other problem. Their labor pool is more like a rushing river of students who come through, who are talented and enthusiastic, but who don't necessarily have digital, project management skills. They don't have a place to sit to do work or a place to log into to do work necessarily. And so we can kind of get together to leverage those labor pools and leverage our budgets in ways that serve both of our purposes, I think. So I see a lot of common research goals between DH and libraries. They don't completely overlap, but there are a lot of places in which they do. And one of these places is something that we talked about this morning, which is transcription. We've been really good at getting all these collections online, but just having images of handwritten things are not accessible, and they can't really be used in a digital world for most of the things that DH folks want to do. So although this isn't really a research goal for a digital humanist, it is kind of a necessary precondition of most of the work that they want to do, which means that if they are putting together a grant to work on a specific group of objects, then transcription is part of what can be paid for in that grant. Enhanced description is another kind of interesting area. This project, Mapping the Stacks, was basically a bunch of University of Chicago grad students who were sent out to mine through libraries and archives in the city and produce this finding aid related to all of the kind of Black history material they found in those archives. So they produced this thematic guide that promotes materials from libraries and allows other scholars to have access to them. So that's an interesting piece of work. Libraries also have a lot of these kind of giant collections of images with kind of 5 lines of text describing them, and then we move on to the next thing. So part of the problem here is that that doesn't make our collections very accessible to non-experts. All of those objects are there for a reason. There's a context, and there's history, and there's a narrative, and content experts like digital humanists can help us tell the stories around those objects that are much more likely to engage non-expert users, make these things accessible in K-12, for example. So that kind of content expertise and interpretive work that digital humanists do is something that could be really useful in the context of our collections as well. If we have all these huge plain text data stores that come out of transcription, the next thing we probably want to do is add some structure to those data stores to make them much more easily searchable, so we can do different and interesting things with discovery and finding interfaces. And in order to do that, there's quite a lot of manual labor involved in structuring full text documents, but there are a lot of folks in the digital humanities who are really into XML. Now, in most cases, libraries can't afford to fund this kind of work ourselves, but if you can get some of those XML folks interested in your project or your content, then you can get a lot of that kind of structured data out of those projects. For example, at UVic, we had our Humanities Computing Center do XML Mark-up, TI Mark-up for the Colonial Dispatches, which is a kind of an important historic collection for us, and now there's so much more we can do with that material than we were able to do before. And another thing that libraries have talked about for a long time, and are still kind of getting our heads around, is linked data. A lot of the really interesting linked data production that's happening in Canada is happening not in the library world, but in the digital humanities. And we see big projects like the Immune in World War I project that's produced more than 80 million triples. I was just talking to Rob, and he said he thinks it's over 100 million now. Places like Quirk has done about 600,000, and Modernist Versions has done about 100,000. So we know that this is a kind of a growth area for libraries, and there's all of this expertise out there, not to mention tools and data sets and other things that we could get our hands on and collaborate in. DH is also really interested in different discovery environments for text, and I think that discovery and search is obviously close to our hearts. What you see on screen here is a product called New Radial, and it's kind of like a faceted, visual, linked data search interface that, in this case, I'm exploring the different kind of iterations of Wolverine in their Marvel Comics collection. But you can go online and kind of look at this interface, and it gives you pause to think about what the next generation of discovery tools are going to look like, and they're probably not just going to be search boxes with lists of results like most of the tools that we're using right now. Another thing that we really need to grapple with in libraries, I think, is making some of our collections more interactive, inviting our users in to link or annotate or add or, kind of work with them in a variety of ways. And especially if scholars are our audience, we want to be able to use the expertise of those folks in our collections. So what I have on the screen here is a project called Infinite Ulysses. And it's basically a kind of prototype coming out of the digital humanities for how you'd collaboratively annotate a text and then make those annotations like readable or accessible, because you can't just have everybody write over everybody else. Then how are you going to access that stuff? So this is a really interesting interface as well that you might want to have a look at. And I think all of these things are really relevant to where we'd like to go with our library collections. And then I was looking at some of the DH conference stuff online, and I found that DH 2017 is going to be in Montreal, and their theme is access. Those of us who've worked with traditional humanities publishers a lot probably don't see humanists as like the OA vanguard especially, but digital humanists are pretty sensitized to a lot of open access issues. And what's more, they're often asked to articulate their knowledge mobilization plans in grants. So that's a great place for libraries to insert themselves and say, hey, we have a lot of open access platforms. We know a lot about Creative Commons licensing. That, come and put your stuff on our platform and we'll work with you. Digital preservation is that kind of looming cloud over all of us, I think. But it's also a huge opportunity for libraries. I can tell you that nobody else on my campus particularly wants to take on this issue. It's a big opportunity for us to step up and show leadership and say, like, this is what we do, and we're going to continue to do this. And digital humanists are extremely worried about this because the kinds of projects they create are not just objects, but they're typically these really complex software platforms that are going to be very hard to preserve. I mean, they are right to be worried, but they're potentially partners for getting funding around some of these issues as well. So the one thing I would say is that UVic is really blessed with a grants librarian. And we have these complementarities and we have all of these streams that could work together, but it's not a trivial matter to make those streams work together and to kind of bridge our cultural gaps and our different administrative issues and all of our different funding agencies. And having a grants librarian who is dedicated to identifying different funding sources or identifying projects on campus where we can be useful, articulating like library in-kind costs and all kinds of things, and having those easily sort of accessible to people who are writing grant applications is really important piece of this puzzle for us. So not to brag, but we do have grants librarians, so it's pretty awesome. So finally, really the message that I have for you today is that it is really critical that we continue to strategically align ourselves with digital humanities, because digital humanities have a lot to offer to us, and we have many common problems and common research goals, and we're working on a lot of the same problems. And we have these unique strengths that allow us together to do a whole bunch of things that neither of us can really do alone. So that's it. I know it's lunchtime, so I would be happy to entertain a quick question if anybody has one, but I'm also happy to take questions on email or to talk to you at lunch about anything you might want to talk about. All right, let's have lunch.